All right, so get ready for a deep dive
Yeah.
into the life of a man
Oh, yeah.
who was part dictator,
Yeah.
part international enigma,
Right.
and a whole lot of, well, let's just say unconventional.
Unconventional. Yeah.
We're talking about Muammar Gaddafi,
Gaddafi, yes.
former leader of Libya.
Right.
You send over some biographical excerpts, and honestly, I'm already hooked.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, to say the least.
Fascinating is an understatement. I mean,
Yeah.
Gaddafi's life was just this whirlwind of political maneuvering,
Yeah, absolutely.
bizarre incidents, and a healthy dose of, let's call it theatric.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So let's set the stage.
Okay.
Gaddafi starts out as a kid from a nomadic family in the Libyan desert.
Right.
How does someone go from that background
Mm.
to becoming the leader of a country?
Yeah,
It's quite a leap.
it really is. And understanding that journey requires looking at Gaddafi's early influences.
Okay, so early influence,
Even as a student, he displayed leadership qualities,
even as a student.
albeit in a rather, shall we say, strict manner.
Okay, strict how so?
The excerpts mention something called the Gaddafi Student Union.
The Gaddafi Student Union.
Yeah, have you heard of this?
I haven't. Tell me more.
So imagine this Gaddafi, as a teenager,
Go.
forms his own student group
Wow.
with a rigid hierarchy, strict rules, and even a ban on communication between members from different branches.
A ban on communication between different branches.
Yeah, crazy, right?
So it's like he was running his own little mini dictatorship in high school.
It was almost like a mini dictatorship in the making, yeah.
Wow, that's wild.
Absolutely.
So were there any early signs of like what his political leanings would be?
The biography highlights his fascination with Gamal Abdel Nasser,
Nasser, okay.
the revolutionary leader of Egypt.
Right.
Nasser's pan-Arabism and socialist policies deeply resonated with Gaddafi, shaping his own political ambitions.
Interesting.
And this influence would become even more pronounced as he rose through the ranks of the Libyan military.
All right, so fast forward to 1969. Libya is under a monarchy,
Right.
and Gaddafi is a junior officer in the army.
Hmm.
Then, bam, coup d'etat.
Here we go.
What can you tell us about that?
Well,
The sources mention some almost comical elements surrounding this event.
oh, absolutely. You see, the original plan was to launch the coup on March 21st.
Okay.
But then a slight hiccup arose.
A hiccup. What do you mean?
Kulthum, a legendary Egyptian singer, was holding a concert in Benghazi on that very day.
Wait a minute.
Yeah,
They postponed a revolution for a concert.
they did.
Seriously.
And not just by a day or two.
No.
The entire coup was pushed back a whole 6 months.
6 months.
Gaddafi and his fellow conspirators were apparently huge fans and refused to miss the performance.
Talk about dedication to music.
Right.
Okay, but 6 months later, they finally decided it was go time, right?
Yeah.
Did everything run smoothly, or are there more unexpected turns?
Well, let's just say the execution of the coup was as colorful as its planning.
Okay.
One of Gaddafi's key men, Captain Mihaishi, was sent to Tripoli to secure a military base.
Okay.
However, he managed to miss his flight
Oh, my God.
and ended up with a standing room only ticket on the next one. Yes, apparently that was a thing back then.
Oh, no. Did he at least manage to hold on to the coup plans?
You'd think, right.
Yeah.
But upon arriving in Tripoli, Mihaishi promptly left his plans and all the weapons meant for the takeover
The weapons.
in a taxi.
In a taxi.
Talk about a rookie mistake.
Wow, this is unbelievable.
I know, right?
What about the other parts of the plan? Were they at least better organized?
Not quite. Another group tasked with seizing an air defense base realized they had barely enough ammunition for 2 bullets per soldier.
2 bullets per soldier.
Hardly a firepower you'd want for a military coup.
Yeah, it sounds like this coup was doomed to fail before it even began.
You would think so.
What about Gaddafi himself? What role did he play in all this chaos?
He had his own series of misadventures.
Oh, boy.
Imagine this: Gaddafi sets off to meet his troops in Benghazi, only to be stopped by 2 policemen who need help fixing their motorcycle.
Oh, what?
Being the helpful soul that he was, he spends hours assisting them,
Seriously.
ultimately losing track of his unit in the dark streets of Benghazi.
Wait, Benghazi didn't have streetlights.
It's true, the city was apparently plunged in darkness, and Gaddafi ended up wandering around lost.
This is getting more and more absurd by the minute.
The entire operation was a symphony of mishaps and sheer luck.
So, with all these blunders, how did Gaddafi actually manage to pull off the coup?
I know, right?
Surely the Libyan government must have put up some kind of fight.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But the reality is Gaddafi practically walked into power unopposed.
What?
He eventually stumbled upon the radio station, walked right in, and announced the revolution over the airwaves.
He just walked right in.
The guards on duty didn't even question him.
It's almost as if everyone involved was simply going through the motions.
Yeah, like they were just waiting for something to happen.
So the king, what happened to him? Was he even aware of what was going on?
King Idris was out of the country at the time, and his son, the crown prince, was apparently too preoccupied with his own affairs to notice a coup unfolding right under his nose.
Wow.
By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late. Gaddafi was in charge.
It's mind-boggling how such a series of improbable events led to the downfall of a monarchy and the rise of a dictatorship.
It really is.
What does this tell us about the political climate of Libya at that time?
It highlights a certain level of instability and perhaps a disconnect between the ruling elite and the general populace.
Okay.
And this allowed someone like Gaddafi, despite his eccentric methods, to exploit the situation and seize power.
So we've got this image of Gaddafi, the former student leader with a penchant for dramatic gestures.
Right.
Stumbling his way into the leadership of a nation.
Yeah, kind of an accidental dictator.
But this is just the beginning of his story, right?
Yeah. Oh, we're just getting started. Gaddafi's time in power was a roller coaster ride of international intrigue, political maneuvering, and yes, even more bizarre anecdotes.
Can't wait to hear more. This is already shaping up to be a wild deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Buckle up.
We'll be back after a short break.
So Gaddafi's in charge now.
Yep.
And the world's watching.
Yeah.
What were the initial reactions to his takeover?
Well, surprisingly, the United States seemed relatively unfazed at first.
Unfazed, really?
Remember, this is the Cold War era.
Right.
And Libya, under King Idris, had close ties to the British.
Okay.
The U.S. saw Gaddafi as a potential opportunity.
An opportunity.
To shift the balance of power in the region.
Interesting. So they were hoping for a more U.S.-friendly Libya?
Yeah, exactly.
Did Gaddafi play along?
Not exactly. He had his own vision for Libya.
Okay.
And it didn't quite align with American interests.
So what happened?
Well, within a year of taking power, he expelled the U.S. Air Force from their base in Libya, sending a clear message that he wasn't going to be anyone's puppet.
That's a bold move.
It was.
And I bet it didn't stop there, did it?
Nope.
Knowing Gaddafi, I'm guessing he had even bigger plans.
You're absolutely right.
Like what?
By 1973, he had nationalized all American oil interests in Libya.
Whoa. He nationalized the oil.
Essentially kicking them out and taking control of their assets.
That's a major escalation.
It was.
You'd think the U.S. would have retaliated in some way.
It's surprising, isn't it? Everyone was bracing for a major international incident.
I would think so.
But the U.S. response was surprisingly muted.
Muted? Why?
And that's because Gaddafi had a secret weapon.
A secret weapon?
His blossoming relationship with the Soviet Union.
Playing both sides of the Cold War.
Classic power move.
But how did this relationship with the Soviets come about?
It
It seems like an unlikely pairing.
was a marriage of convenience, really.
Right.
For the Soviets, Gaddafi was a dream come true.
A dream come true. How so?
Most of their allies were constantly needing financial aid.
Right.
But Gaddafi was flush with oil money.
Yeah.
And more than willing to spend it on Soviet weaponry.
Wow.
We're talking billions of dollars worth of arms deals.
So a reliable customer.
Yes.
And a way to poke the U.S. in the eye.
Exactly.
I can see why the Soviets were so keen on keeping Gaddafi happy.
Yeah, they were happy to have him on their side.
But did this alliance also come with its own set of challenges?
Oh, of course.
After all, Gaddafi wasn't exactly known for his predictability.
Oh, the challenges were plentiful, believe me.
I bet.
Gaddafi was a master of keeping everyone on their toes.
So I've heard.
Even his allies.
Really?
There are stories about him showing up in Moscow unannounced.
Unannounced.
Demanding to see Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, in the middle of the night.
Wait, seriously?
Oh, yeah.
He just expected the leader of a superpower to be available for a chat at any given moment.
It seems that way.
That's audacious.
It was.
Even for Gaddafi.
Even for Gaddafi.
Tell me more about these unscheduled visits.
Okay, so picture this.
Okay.
A freezing cold night in Moscow.
Got it.
Gaddafi's plane lands.
Uh-huh.
The door opens and he sends out an emissary to inquire, "Where's my brother Brezhnev?"
Brother Brezhnev.
Keep in mind there is a significant age difference between them.
Okay.
Brezhnev could have easily been his father.
That's hilarious.
It is.
I can only imagine the scramble that ensued on the Soviet side.
It was pure chaos.
Really?
Top diplomats rushed to the airport.
Oh my gosh.
Stood out there in the freezing cold for hours.
Oh no.
Sending endless bottles of mineral water onto the plane.
Wow.
All to appease Gaddafi.
And did it work? Did he eventually get his brotherly meeting?
Not quite.
What a hack.
After 2 hours of this charade,
2 hours.
he simply took off and flew back home without ever setting foot off the plane.
Are you kidding?
All that for some mineral water and a bit of diplomatic chaos.
It sounds like he was toying with them.
Yeah, a little bit.
Testing the limits of their patience.
For sure.
Were there any other instances of Gaddafi's, let's say, unique approach to diplomacy with the Soviets?
Oh, there are plenty.
Give me another one.
There's another story about him refusing to visit a Soviet military base.
Okay.
Because according to him, there weren't enough stars in the sky that night.
Not enough stars.
Then on another occasion, he suddenly decided he wanted to witness a Muslim funeral.
A Muslim funeral?
Which, of course, the Soviets had to scramble to arrange for him.
Oh, wow.
Since there weren't any scheduled at the time.
These stories are unbelievable.
They are.
It's like he was treating international diplomacy as his own personal stage show.
That's a pretty apt description.
And it wasn't just limited to the Soviets, was it?
No, it wasn't.
Gaddafi had a global audience in mind.
He did.
For instance, there's the whole saga of his relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons.
Oh, yes, that's right.
He was practically obsessed with acquiring them, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He tried repeatedly to purchase them from China, showing little interest in any other forms of collaboration. It was almost as if acquiring nuclear weapons was the ultimate status symbol in his mind.
Yeah, it's like he was playing a real-life game of Risk.
Right.
Trying to amass the ultimate weapon.
Exactly.
But his eccentricities didn't end there, did they?
No, they didn't.
There was also that rather awkward fascination with Condoleezza Rice.
Oh, yes. How could we forget that?
His infatuation with the then U.S. Secretary of State was, well, let's just say it raised a few eyebrows.
It certainly did.
He showered her with lavish gifts, referred to her as our African girl, and insisted on having private dinners with her.
Yeah, it was a bit much.
That's a bit creepy, to be honest.
It was a bizarre situation.
Yeah.
And it definitely didn't win him any favors on the international stage.
It's like he was completely oblivious to the inappropriateness of his actions.
Maybe he was.
But then again, Gaddafi seemed to thrive on this kind of attention, positive or negative.
That's true.
He was a master of self-promotion.
He was.
Even if it sometimes veered into the realm of the absurd. It's almost as if he was deliberately cultivating this image of himself as the unpredictable, enigmatic leader.
Yeah, like he wanted to keep everyone guessing.
But underneath all the theatrics, what was really driving Gaddafi?
That's a good question.
Was it a genuine desire to improve the lives of Libyans, or was it all just a power grab disguised as revolution?
That's a question that historians continue to grapple with.
Yeah.
To understand Gaddafi, you have to look beyond the surface.
Okay.
Beyond the outlandish behavior and the calculated provocations.
So let's peel back another layer of the onion, shall we?
Let's do it.
We've talked about Gaddafi's international exploits, his love of the spotlight, but what about his domestic policies?
Right.
How did his leadership actually impact the people of Libya?
Well, that's where the narrative takes a more complex turn.
Okay.
On one hand, Gaddafi implemented social programs aimed at improving education and healthcare.
Okay.
And he invested heavily in infrastructure projects.
So some positive.
Yeah. But on the other hand, his rule was marked by authoritarianism, suppression of dissent, and a cult of personality that permeated every aspect of Libyan society.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
It sounds like a classic case of a leader with good intentions gone awry.
It's possible.
But we can't ignore the darker aspects of his regime.
No, we can't.
The sources mention public executions and a climate of fear.
Unfortunately, those accounts are accurate.
Okay.
Gaddafi was ruthless in crushing any opposition to his rule.
So not just a harmless eccentric, then.
His Green Book, a bizarre mix of socialist and Islamic ideas, became the blueprint for a state that controlled every aspect of life, from the economy to personal freedoms.
Wow, so a very controlling regime.
Very controlling.
And while he presented himself as a champion of the people, his regime was ultimately built on fear and repression.
That's the irony, isn't it?
It is.
He talked about empowering the people, but he ruled through fear.
So we have this complex picture emerging, a man capable of both generosity and cruelty, a leader who oscillated between revolutionary idealism and dictatorial control.
Exactly.
And let's not forget his peculiar personal style. You mentioned the Green Book, but there's also his famous obsession with the color green itself.
Oh, yes. Gaddafi's love for green was legendary.
Tell me more about that.
It became a symbol of his regime appearing everywhere, from the national flag,
Which was
entirely green for a period,
real
to his clothing and even his cars.
Wow.
And then, of course, there was his preference for living in a tent.
In a tent, even while he was running a country.
Even when attending international summits.
Well, you're telling me he brought his tent with him to events like the UN General Assembly?
Absolutely. He even set up a traditional Bedouin tent on the grounds of a mansion he rented in Inglewood, New Jersey, during a visit to the UN.
A tent in New Jersey.
It caused quite a stir, to say the least.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it was quite the spectacle.
Okay, I have to ask, what was the deal with the tent? Was it a symbolic gesture? A way to stay connected to his Bedouin roots? Or just another one of his eccentricities?
It was likely a combination of factors. Gaddafi saw himself as a man of the people.
Okay.
And the tent symbolized simplicity and his connection to the common man.
Right.
But it was also a powerful image, a way to project an aura of authenticity and differentiate himself from other world leaders.
So a carefully crafted image.
It seems that way.
Even in his choice of dwelling.
Exactly.
It seems like everything Gaddafi did had a deeper meaning, even if it wasn't always apparent on the surface.
That's Gaddafi for you, always keeping us guessing.
All right, so we've talked about Gaddafi's rise to power, his complex relationships with other countries, and his, shall we say, unique leadership style. But his story doesn't end there, right? What about his later years? Did he ever mellow out, or did he stay true to his unpredictable nature?
Well, if you're hoping for a tale of peaceful retirement and quiet reflection, you're in for a bit of a surprise. Gaddafi remained a force to be reckoned with right up until the very end.
Okay, so no peaceful sunset years for Gaddafi. The sources mentioned that he did eventually try to make amends with the West. What prompted this change of heart?
It seems like the downfall of Saddam Hussein in 2003 served as a wake-up call for Gaddafi. He saw what happened to a dictator who overplayed his hand, and he didn't want to meet the same fate.
That makes sense. So what did this attempt at reconciliation look like? Did he just suddenly become best friends with the West?
Not quite. It was more of a strategic realignment. He renounced his weapons of mass destruction program, agreed to compensate the victims of the Lockerbie bombing, and even went so far as to support Chechnya in its conflict with Russia, a clear jab at his former Soviet allies.
Hold on a minute. Supporting Chechnya. Why Chechnya? That seems like a random choice.
It wasn't random at all. Chechnya was a thorn in Russia's side, and Gaddafi saw an opportunity to weaken his former allies while simultaneously currying favor with the West. It was a classic Gaddafi move, bold, unpredictable, and calculated to shake up the status quo.
So he was essentially playing a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, using Chechnya as a pawn to advance his own interests. But did this newfound cooperation with the West last? Did he really manage to shed his mad dog image?
Well, let's just say old habits die hard, despite his attempts at rapprochement. Gaddafi still had a knack for grand gestures that often backfired spectacularly. Remember the Lockerbie bomber? The man who was released from a Scottish prison on compassionate grounds due to a terminal illness?
Yeah, I vaguely remember that it was a pretty controversial decision at the time.
Well, Gaddafi decided to roll out the red carpet for the bomber upon his return to Libya, organizing a hero's welcome complete with cheering crowds and a televised ceremony.
Oh, wow. That's not exactly the best way to build bridges with the international community. I can only imagine how the British, who had released the bomber in the first place, reacted to that.
They were furious, to say the least. It was a major diplomatic blunder that undermined all the progress Gaddafi had made in repairing relations with the West. It was almost as if he couldn't resist the urge to thumb his nose at those he had recently tried to befriend.
It's like he was 2 steps forward, 1 giant leap back, and all this is happening right as the Arab Spring uprisings begin to sweep across the Middle East. How did Gaddafi respond to these events?
Initially, he seemed confident that his regime could weather the storm. He dismissed the protests as the work of foreign agents and vowed to crush any dissent with an iron fist. But as the uprisings gained momentum and other long-standing dictators began to fall, the pressure on Gaddafi intensified.
So did he finally realize that his time was up? Did he consider stepping down peacefully?
Not a chance. Gaddafi clung to power with everything he had, unleashing a brutal crackdown on protesters. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, and soon NATO forces intervened to protect civilians.
This is the point where Gaddafi's story takes a really dark turn. The images of the fighting the refugees fleeing the country was all over the news. What were his final days like?
They were chaotic and violent. Gaddafi went into hiding, moving from one secret location to another, issuing defiant pronouncements and vowing to fight to the death. There were reports of him holed up in a bunker surrounded by loyalists, still clinging to the hope of a last-minute victory.
It's a tragic end for someone who had once been a symbol of revolutionary change. what ultimately led to his downfall.
Hmm.
Was it the NATO intervention, the internal rebellion, or a combination of factors?
It was a confluence of events, really. The Arab Spring uprisings created an environment ripe for change, exposing the cracks in Gaddafi's regime. The brutal crackdown on protesters alienated many of his former supporters, and the NATO intervention tipped the balance of power in favor of the rebel.
And what about Gaddafi himself? How did it all end for him?
In a manner befitting his dramatic life, Gaddafi's final moments were a mix of the surreal and the tragic. He was captured by rebel forces hiding in a drainage pipe, a far cry from the palaces and tents he had once inhabited. He was killed shortly thereafter, his reign of over 4 decades coming to a sudden and violent end.
Wow. From revolutionary leader to international pariah to hiding in a drainage pipe. It's a dramatic arc, to say the least.
Gaddafi's life was a study in contradictions. He was a man capable of great charisma and cruelty. A leader who inspired both admiration and fear, he was a master manipulator who played the global stage to his advantage. Yet he ultimately fell victim to the forces of history he had tried so hard to control.
It's a story that continues to fascinate and repel in equal measure, and it leaves us with more questions than answers. Was Gaddafi a true believer in his own ideology, or was it all just a facade for a power grab? Was he a visionary leader who lost his way, or a ruthless dictator from the start?
Those are questions for each of us to ponder. Gaddafi's legacy is a complex one, full of triumphs and tragedies, moments of brilliance and acts of barbarity. He was a product of his time, a man who rose to power in a turbulent era and left behind a legacy that will continue to be debated for generations to come.
Well, there you have it. Our deep dive into the world of Muammar Gaddafi, a man who was larger than life, yet ultimately a prisoner of his own contradictions. It's a story that reminds us that history is rarely black and white, and that even the most outlandish figures are ultimately human, capable of both great and terrible things. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did.
It was a pleasure to be here.